The grand ballroom at Montfort House shimmered under the glow of 100 candles, the scent of roses and wine filling the air as the aristocracy danced and mingled. The music played softly, a waltz so familiar it seemed almost to float above the room. But for Duke Julian Montfort, it was nothing but a dull hum. His gaze, sharp and unblinking, was fixed on one person, Miss Clara Ashford. She was standing near the edge of the room, laughing with his younger brother, Sebastian. Clara's hand rested lightly on Sebastian's arm as she spoke, her smile radiant, her eyes full of life. Julian's chest tightened at the sight, her beauty, her warmth. She had brought something into this cold, lifeless house that made everything else feel muted by comparison. But it wasn't just her charm that stirred him. It was the way she looked at Sebastian, the way she seemed at ease with him. Sebastian laughed, his arm around Clara's waist, guiding her effortlessly through the crowd, completely unaware of the storm brewing just a few paces away. Julian's jaw clenched, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. He couldn't stand it. His brother, with his charm, his easy smile, the warmth that seemed to pour from him with every word, every gesture. Sebastian's affection seemed to flow so naturally, so easily. He'd been kind to Clara, much kinder than Julian ever had been. And yet, "You're flirting with the wrong brother, Miss Ashford." The words came out of Julian's mouth before he could stop them, his voice colder than the marble floors beneath his boots. He moved swiftly across the room, his steps quick and purposeful, every inch of him radiating an intensity that made the guests take a step back. He grabbed Clara's wrist, his grip firm but not painful, and without a word of explanation, he pulled her away from the crowd and into the shadowed corridor beyond the ballroom. Clara gasped, a sharp intake of breath that made Julian's pulse race. The dark hallway was empty, save for the two of them, the soft echo of the music still vibrating through the walls, but it felt as though the entire world had fallen away. Julian pressed her back against the cool stone, his body close to hers, trapping her there with nothing but the heat of his presence. Clara's breath was shallow, her eyes wide, but she didn't pull away. Julian felt a flicker of something, desire, maybe, or rage, but he couldn't focus on that now. He couldn't focus on anything except the burning ache that had been growing inside him for weeks. "You're flirting with the wrong brother, Miss Ashford," he repeated, his voice lower now, edged with something dangerous. His thumb brushed against the delicate pulse on her wrist, feeling the rapid beat beneath her skin. He watched as her breath hitched, as her chest rose and fell in time with her racing heartbeat. Clara's eyes flashed with something like defiance. "Am I? Because he's been kind to me." The words hit Julian like a slap. Kind? Was that all she saw in his brother? The thought made his insides twist. He had given nothing to her. Nothing of himself. Nothing of his heart. He had kept her at a distance. Always too proud. Too cold to show her even the smallest sign of affection. And now Sebastian was making it look so easy, so effortless, that it burned. "You want kindness?" Julian's voice was harsh, the bitterness clear as he leaned closer, his face inches from hers. He felt the heat radiating from her, the pull of something that was both maddening and intoxicating. His hand, still resting on her wrist, slid gently to her throat, his thumb pressing against the soft skin there. "Is that really what you want, Clara? Tepid kindness from a man who will forget you the moment something shinier catches his eye." Her breath quickened again, but she didn't back away. Instead, her eyes darkened with something he couldn't quite decipher. "What else could I want? You've made it perfectly clear I'm nothing to you. You barely speak to me. You look through me like I'm invisible." The words stung more than he had expected. He wanted to argue, to tell her that he hadn't meant to ignore her, that he hadn't known how to act, but he couldn't find the words. He only felt the sharp ache of truth settling into his chest. He had pushed her away, but now that she was as close, now that he had her in his grasp, the pain of that distance was too much to bear. "Nothing?" he asked, his voice cracking, the words coming out more raw than he had intended. His forehead dropped to hers, his eyes closing as he struggled to regain control of himself. "You think you're nothing to me?" Her eyes fluttered shut at his words, her lips parting as though to speak, but nothing came out. Julian's heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, all he could do was breathe her in, her scent, the softness of her skin, the warmth of her breath against his. "I can't breathe when you're in the same room," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I can't think. I can't sleep. All I see is you. All I want is you." Her lips parted as if to respond, but before she could speak, the sound of voices echoed down the corridor, harsh and sudden. The moment shattered like glass, and Julian pulled away as quickly as he had approached, his hands trembling at his sides. He turned on his heel, his heart hammering in his chest, his mind reeling from the electric charge that had passed between them. But as he walked away, Clarara's voice, breathless and angry, followed him down the corridor. "You can't just—" He didn't turn back. He couldn't. The scene was over, but the storm was only beginning. 3 weeks earlier, Clarara Ashford had arrived at Montfort House with nothing but a worn traveling bag and desperate hope. She had no idea that 2 brothers would change her life forever, or that she'd choose the wrong one first. The rain fell in a steady, unrelenting downpour as Clarara Ashford's carriage creaked along the dirt road that led to Montfort House. The wheels splashed through puddles, and the sound of the storm was a constant, deafening roar against the windows. Inside, Clarara sat in silence, her thoughts a whirl of confusion and dread. She had never imagined she would be reduced to this, arriving at a grand estate as a paid companion to an elderly duchess, her only belongings a small, weathered bag that rested beside her. Her father's reckless gambling had destroyed their family's fortune, and Clarara was left with no other option but to seek employment. It was a bitter reality for a woman once accustomed to a different life. When the carriage finally pulled up to the towering gates of Montfort House, Clarara could hardly bear to look at the grandeur that awaited her. The estate was a sprawling masterpiece of stone and ivy, a symbol of everything she had lost. A servant greeted her as she stepped from the carriage, and Clarara was ushered into a vast entrance hall, its high ceilings echoing with every footstep. The cold marble floors gleamed under the flickering candlelight, and Clarara was immediately struck by the oppressive grandeur of the place. She could not help but feel small and insignificant in such a setting, like a drop in an endless ocean. It wasn't long before Clarara was introduced to her new employer, Dowager Duchess Beatrice Montfort. At 65, Beatrice was a woman of commanding presence, her sharp eyes taking in everything around her. But there was warmth in her gaze as she offered Clarara a gracious smile. "Welcome, my dear," she said in a voice that held both kindness and authority. "I'm sure you'll find your stay here a comfortable one." Beatrice explained Clarara's position with simple, matter-of-fact words. £50 per annum, room and board in exchange for companionship and assistance. Clarara's heart sank as she realized the full extent of her situation, but she nodded, forcing a smile. The Duchess led her through the corridors of Montfort House, pointing out the various rooms and giving her a brief tour. Clarara did her best to maintain composure, but it was impossible to ignore the contrast between the opulence of the house and the stark reality of her new life. As they walked, Clarara's attention was caught by a man who appeared in the hallway ahead. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and impossibly handsome, his dark hair neatly styled and his face carved with an aristocratic sharpness that made Clarara feel as if she were staring at a statue come to life. He paused as he caught sight of them, his cold blue eyes briefly flicking over Clarara before his gaze returned to his mother. "Mother's new companion, I presume?" he asked in a tone that was dismissive, barely sparing Clarara a second glance before he continued on his way. It stung, though Clarara told herself she shouldn't care. Who was he, after all? Just another aristocrat who couldn't be bothered with someone of her station. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of being invisible in his presence. Beatrice, however, didn't seem perturbed. "Don't mind Julian," she said with a small smile, her voice tinged with a knowing warmth. "He's forgotten how to be human." Clara couldn't help but wonder what that meant. Who was this Julian, and why did Beatrice speak of him so differently from the others? It was then that the younger brother appeared. Sebastian Montfort was the polar opposite of his sibling. Where Julian was cold and aloof, Sebastian was warm, charming, and quick to make Clara feel at ease. He introduced himself with a smile that seemed to light up the room. "I'd be happy to show you around, Miss Ashford," he said, his voice smooth and pleasant, with a hint of humor. "I'll make sure you don't get lost in this maze of rooms." He walked her through the gardens, pointing out the various flowers, making her laugh with light-hearted remarks. There was something so refreshing about him. His presence was easy, unguarded. Clara found herself feeling more at ease than she had expected, but also guilty, as though she shouldn't be so grateful for the kindness of a man who was, after all, far above her. But Sebastian didn't treat her as though she were beneath him. He spoke to her as an equal, showing genuine interest in her thoughts, her opinions. It was a kindness she hadn't experienced in months. But Clara couldn't forget the chill of Julian's gaze, even if it had only lasted for a moment. As she and Sebastian strolled to the gardens, she couldn't help but notice how much the landscape mirrored their personalities. The vibrant flowers, the warm sunshine, were reflected in Sebastian's easy manner, while the dark shadows cast by the towering trees seemed to mirror the distance between her and Julian. Later that evening at dinner, Clara could hardly focus on her food, her mind preoccupied with thoughts of the two brothers. Sebastian was attentive, making her laugh with stories of his travels, and she was grateful for his kindness. But then, at the far end of the table, she caught sight of Julian once more. He was seated across from his mother, barely acknowledging anyone around him. His eyes flickered over her for a brief moment, and Clara felt a strange shiver run down her spine. He looked through her as though she didn't even exist, his gaze distant, unfocused. As the evening wore on, Clara told herself it didn't matter. It was clear that Julian had no interest in her. He barely seemed to notice her presence. But as the night wore on and Sebastian continued to make her laugh, she began to realize something else. Julian's indifference stung in a way she couldn't quite explain. She wanted to believe it didn't matter. He was distant, cold, unreachable. But there was something in the way he had looked at her, just for a moment, that lingered in her mind. And as she lay in her small, comfortable room that night, staring out at the moonlit gardens, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that her arrival at Montfort House had set something in motion, something she couldn't control, and perhaps didn't even understand. Two very different brothers. One made her feel seen. The other made her feel invisible. The question was, who was she supposed to want? And was it possible that she had already made the wrong choice? The first week at Montfort House passed in a blur, each day blending into the next as Clara adjusted to her new life. Sebastian Montfort's attention was a constant, warm presence in her days. Every morning, he sought her out for a ride through the estate's vast grounds, offering gentle instruction on horseback riding. His hands often lingered on her waist as he steadied her, and the warmth of his touch sent an unspoken promise through Clara's chest. It was innocent, the way he helped her mount and dismount, the way his laughter filled the air during their morning rides, but it made Clara's heart flutter in a way she couldn't ignore. She had not felt such attention in years, certainly not since her father's fall from grace had left her isolated and forgotten. It was not just that Sebastian was kind, it was the way he made her feel seen, heard, as though she mattered. She hadn't known a man's kindness could make her feel like she was worthy of something more. In the afternoons, they walked through the garden together, Sebastian picking flowers for her as they talked about everything from literature to the weather. He made her laugh, something that felt both strange and familiar, a reminder of a time when she had been carefree. They spent hours in the library, discussing books, and Clara could not help but feel a warmth that she had not allowed herself to feel in years. It was easy to be with Sebastian, effortless, and for the first time in a long time, Clara allowed herself to believe that perhaps there could be something more between them, though she knew the reality of their stations made any such thought impossible. He was a lord, with wealth and position, and she was a paid companion, nothing more than a shadow in his world. But still, the moments they shared made her heart ache with a hope she dared not acknowledge. And yet, through it all, she felt the shadow of Julian Montfort lurking in the background. He was always there, watching from afar, his presence like a distant storm, felt but not seen. From the study window, he watched the garden walks, his eyes following their every movement. In the library doorway, his cold gaze rested on their conversations. At dinner, he rarely spoke to her, but she could feel his eyes on her, his sharp, icy stare cutting through the laughter she shared with Sebastian. It was as though he could not bear to see her with his younger brother, and the tension between them became palpable. Sebastian, ever the charmer, seemed unaware of the undercurrent of animosity that rippled beneath the surface. He continued to pursue her with warmth, with kindness, always making her feel like the most important person in the room. But Clara could not ignore the sense that she was being watched by someone who made her feel as though her every movement was being weighed and judged. Julian was colder than ever, distant and aloof. He never acknowledged her directly, his rare words always clipped and formal. Once, when he passed her in the hallway, he barely glanced in her direction and muttered, "Mother's new companion, I presume?" His tone was dismissive, as though she were an inconvenience rather than a person. It stung. But Clara swallowed her pride and refused to let his indifference affect her. Still, she couldn't help but notice him. His presence was like an invisible force, pulling at her even when she tried to ignore it. The discomfort only deepened during one particular encounter in the stables. It was a quiet afternoon when Sebastian helped her dismount from her horse, his hands warm on her waist, his fingers lingering just a moment too long. Clara's heart skipped a beat, and she was suddenly acutely aware of the closeness between them. Just as Sebastian smiled down at her, his arm casually draped across her shoulders, a cold voice sliced through the air. "Sebastian, a word. Now." Julian's voice was sharp, cutting to the quiet like a knife. The two brothers exchanged a look, Sebastian's expression unreadable, Julian's cold and angry. Clara watched as Julian's gaze flickered briefly over her, and though his face remained impassive, she could feel the tension in his body as he waited for Sebastian to follow him. There was no mistaking it. Julian was angry. Sebastian, ever the good-natured one, seemed unfazed, though his smile faltered for a moment. He gave Clara a quick, apologetic glance before turning to follow his brother. Clara lingered in the stables, her mind racing. She had overheard only bits of their conversation, but the sharpness in Julian's tone and the defensive edge in Sebastian's voice told her that something was not right. It was as if there was more to their relationship than the easy camaraderie Sebastian displayed. Was Julian angry because of her? Did his coldness have to do with her growing closeness to his brother? The thought made her heart race with a mixture of confusion and intrigue. What was it about Julian Montfort that made her feel so exposed, so vulnerable, even when he didn't speak to her? As the days passed, Clara found herself caught in the quiet tension between the two brothers. Sebastian continued his gentle courtship, his kindness never wavering, but Clara became increasingly uncomfortable. She began to realize that she could not simply ignore the way her heart responded to his touch, to his laughter. She knew deep down that what they shared was fleeting, a harmless flirtation. He was engaged, after all. Yet, despite this knowledge, she allowed herself to indulge in the attention he lavished on her. It was only when she saw Julian again, watching him from the shadows, that she realized how deeply conflicted she was. The air between them seemed charged with something unspoken, something neither of them was willing to acknowledge. Julian's icy demeanor never faltered, yet his gaze on her was unmistakable. When their eyes met across the room, Clara could feel the weight of his stare like a physical presence, and it made her stomach tighten in a way she didn't understand. For a brief moment, she had the unnerving sensation that he saw her in a way no one else did, no one else could. It was unsettling, but it also made her heart beat faster. By the end of the first week, Clara thought she understood her situation clearly. Sebastian liked her, perhaps even courted her in his own quiet way. He was kind, charming, and made her feel like she belonged, even if she knew it was an impossible dream. Julian, on the other hand, tolerated her presence, and she could feel the coldness that surrounded him. It was simple. It was clear, or so she thought. But deep down, she knew it was not so simple at all. It was impossible to ignore the pull between herself and Julian, the way he made her feel exposed even when he said nothing, the way his presence seemed to fill every room, even when he wasn't speaking to her. It made her question everything she thought she knew about her situation, about herself. What if she was falling for the wrong brother? What if, in trying to keep herself safe with Sebastian, she was unknowingly walking towards something far more dangerous and far more thrilling than she ever expected? The afternoon tea in Dowager Duchess Beatrice's sitting room was a rare moment of quiet in the otherwise bustling Montfort house. The storm outside had finally begun to subside, leaving a damp, cool air that filtered through the tall windows. Beatrice, as always, was calm and composed, her sharp eyes gleaming behind her spectacles as she poured Clara a cup of tea. "Tell me, my dear," Beatrice began, her voice warm but with a careful edge. "How are you finding life here so far?" Clara hesitated, feeling the weight of question. She had been here for nearly a week now, and while the days had been pleasant enough, Sebastian's constant company making the transition easier than she'd expected, there was a sense of unease that lingered beneath the surface. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking on a precarious ledge, one that could crumble beneath her at any moment. Still, she couldn't bring herself to admit to Beatrice what she had been feeling. The Duchess had been kind to her, but Clara knew that kindness was always tempered with sharp awareness of status. It's been lovely," Clara answered, taking a sip of tea to steady her nerves. Beatrice's eyes never left her face, reading her like a book. "I'm glad to hear that," she said, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "I trust you're enjoying Sebastian's company." The question was innocent enough, but Clara felt her stomach twist. She had not allowed herself to acknowledge it fully, but the attention Sebastian had given her was beginning to weigh heavily on her heart. She didn't want to speak of it, didn't want to admit how his warmth and easy affection had made her feel like something more than just a forgotten woman, but Beatrice's knowing gaze made it impossible to hide. "Yes," Clara said softly, "he's been very kind to me. I appreciate his company." Beatrice's smile widened, though there was a quiet sadness in her eyes. "He's a good man," she said, her voice tinged with a certain wistfulness. "But kindness, my dear, is sometimes a luxury that cannot last." Clara frowned, unsure of the meaning behind the statement. "I don't understand," she admitted. Beatrice's gaze softened, though the weight of her words was unmistakable. "Sebastian is engaged, Clara," she said gently, "to Lady Amelia Hartwick. The wedding is planned for 3 months from now." The words hit Clara like a blow to the chest. She could feel the blood drain from her face as the truth sank in. Sebastian, kind, charming Sebastian, was already promised to another. A marriage arranged since childhood, a contract signed, settlements arranged. She had never once considered that their time together, their pleasant exchanges, had been anything more than a fleeting moment in his life. He had been kind, but kindness had never meant anything deeper than that. Clara swallowed hard, fighting the sudden wave of humiliation that washed over her. She had allowed herself to believe that Sebastian's attention meant something, allowed herself to hope that perhaps, just perhaps, there could be more between them. But now the truth was glaringly clear, and she felt foolish for having misread every smile, every laugh, every moment they had shared. She felt like a fool for thinking that she could be anything more than a passing distraction in his life. Beatrice watched her with a knowing expression, a small sigh escaping her lips. "Did you think," she began gently, her voice filled with quiet understanding, "did you think Sebastian was courting you?" Clara felt her throat tighten as she struggled to hold back tears. She wanted to be angry at herself for being so naive, angry at Sebastian for playing with her heart. But there was a deeper, more profound sense of humiliation that made it impossible to speak. "I never meant to hurt you, my dear," Beatrice continued. "Sebastian is a man who offers affection easily, but he does not give his heart easily. His heart is already promised elsewhere." The words were painful, but Clara knew they were true. Sebastian had always been kind to her, but that kindness had been nothing more than a momentary flicker in the grand scheme of his life. And now, that flicker was gone, replaced by the cold, hard truth that there would be no future for them. Beatrice's next words were softer, but still edged with wisdom that Clara could not ignore. "Julian, on the other hand," Beatrice said, "has never offered his heart to anyone. He guards it like a fortress. But when he loves absolutely." Clara felt a shiver run through her at the words. She had no idea why, but the mention of Julian's name made something stir deep within her, something she had been trying to ignore for days now. She had felt the weight of his gaze on her more times than she cared to admit. It had unsettled her, made her feel as though he saw through her, as though he knew something she didn't. And now, with Beatrice's cryptic words, Clara realized she could no longer ignore the tension that had been building between them. But still, she couldn't imagine that the Duke of Montfort, cold, distant, imperious Julian, could possibly feel anything for her. "Julian doesn't even see me," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. She couldn't bring herself to say more, to admit to Beatrice what she had been thinking for days now. But Beatrice's smile grew a little more knowing, her eyes twinkling with something Clara couldn't quite place. "Doesn't he?" Beatrice asked softly. "I suggest you look more carefully, child." Clara felt a wave of confusion and uncertainty wash over her. What did Beatrice mean? Was there something between her and Julian that she had missed? It seemed impossible. Julian had barely spoken to her, let alone treated her with any kindness. But the idea that he had been watching her, that there was something in his cold gaze that she had failed to recognize, sent a jolt through her. She had always believed that Julian saw her as little more than a companion, a nothing. But what if she had been wrong? What if, despite his coldness, he had seen something in her that she hadn't yet seen in herself? The thought was enough to make her head spin. Beatrice's expression softened as she leaned back in her chair, watching Clara with a knowing smile. "You are a clever girl, Clara," she said gently. "But sometimes the truth is right in front of you, and you don't see it because you don't want to." Clara sat in silence, the weight of Beatrice's words sinking in. She had thought she understood everything. She had thought Sebastian was a safe, uncomplicated choice. But now, with the revelation of his engagement, everything had changed. She could no longer pretend that her feelings for him had been anything more than a fleeting fantasy. And as for Julian, what was it that Beatrice had seen? Clara wasn't sure she was ready to confront the truth, but it seemed she had no choice. The moment of clarity had come, and with it, a new and terrifying realization. She had no idea where her heart truly lay. That night, as Clara wandered the halls of Montfort House in search of solitude, she stumbled upon the library. She had never been inside before, but something pulled her toward it, as though the quiet silence of the books could offer her some peace. She found a corner, tucked away from the rest of the world, and settled down with a book in her lap. But before she could read a word, the door opened, and Julian Montfort stepped inside. Clara's heart skipped a beat at the sight of him. He walked past her without acknowledging her presence. But Clara felt the tension between them like a living, breathing thing. It was only when he paused, his back turned to her, that she allowed herself to speak. "I didn't expect to find anyone here," she said softly. Julian's shoulders stiffened, and for a long moment he didn't answer. But then, without turning around, he spoke in a voice so low that Clara could barely hear it. "I come here to think," he said. "I don't usually expect company." The words were simple, but there was something in them, something raw and unguarded, that made Clara's heart race. For a moment, it felt as though the walls between them were beginning to crack. And as their eyes met across the room, Clara realized with a shock that she was no longer sure who she was supposed to want. The truth had been revealed, and it had changed everything. The tension at Montfort House seemed to grow with each passing day, the air thick with unspoken words, charged glances, and barely concealed emotions. It was impossible for Clara to ignore it any longer. Sebastian's pursuit of her, once so flattering and easy, had started to feel more like a weight she couldn't bear. Every moment they spent together was now tinged with guilt, the painful awareness that he was already promised to Lady Amelia Hartwick, a woman he would marry in a few short months. Despite the truth that had been revealed to her, Sebastian continued to seek her out, his charm as effortless as ever. He still walked with her in the gardens, still held her hand as they rode through the estate, and still made her laugh with his light-hearted banter. But now, each touch, each smile, felt like a reminder of how wrong their connection was. She could no longer pretend that she didn't know the truth, that Sebastian's kindness had been nothing more than fleeting affection. Yet despite her attempt to pull away, he pressed on, as though oblivious of the change in her demeanor. "Clara, have I offended you somehow?" he asked one evening, his brow furrowed with genuine concern as she tried to distance herself from him without appearing cold. His question cut through her like a knife, and she swallowed hard, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she couldn't explain without revealing what she knew. What could she say? That she had come to understand that his kindness wasn't real, that she had misread every look, every word, every laugh? She could not do that. She couldn't expose herself so completely. And so she kept quiet, forcing a polite smile. "No, of course not. I just think we both need some space," she lied, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside. But the more she tried to distance herself from Sebastian, the more Julian's presence seemed to grow. It was as if his cold eyes were constantly on her, watching from shadows. She could feel him in every room, his gaze a palpable force that both unsettled and intrigued her. His presence was magnetic, and though he said little to her, his silence was loud with something Clara couldn't quite understand. The realization was maddening, but it was undeniable. She was drawn to him. He was the one she thought of when she lay awake at night, the one whose name seemed to echo in her thoughts despite her efforts to ignore it. His coldness, once so infuriating, now seemed like a shield he wore to protect himself, and Clara found herself wanting to know what lay beneath that fortress. But Julian, for all his brooding intensity, remained distant, and the more she longed for anything from him, the more his silence seemed to deepen. The jealousy between the brothers was starting to become a tangible thing. Julian had watched them from afar for days, his dark gaze always following their interactions, whether in the garden, in the library, or even across the dinner table. His presence at these moments was so unmistakable, so suffocating, that Clara began to feel like a piece in a game of which she had no understanding. And then one afternoon, it all came to a head. She had been riding with Sebastian again, enjoying the gentle breeze that whipped through her hair, when Sebastian, emboldened by their shared moments, tried to kiss her. It was as though the world stopped for a moment. His lips brushed her cheek, a light touch, but Clara immediately turned her face away. "Please don't, my lord. It's not appropriate," she said, her voice tight with discomfort. The words were out before she could stop them, and for a moment the air between them was thick with awkwardness. Sebastian's expression faltered, and he stepped back, clearly hurt, though he masked it with a soft laugh. "I understand," he said, his tone light, but Clara could see the flicker of disappointment in his eyes. Before she could say anything further, her heart skipped a beat as she noticed Julian standing in the doorway of the stables, his dark eyes trained on them with sharp intensity. It was impossible to miss the way his jaw clenched at the sight of them, Sebastian with his arm around her waist, so casual, so familiar. The moment was electric, and Clara could feel the weight of Julian's gaze like a physical touch. He didn't speak, didn't move, but there was something in his stillness that made Clara's pulse race. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Clara and Sebastian standing in silence, the air still crackling with unspoken tension. Later that evening, at dinner, the atmosphere was colder than ever. Julian's presence, once always a quiet, unremarkable thing, had turned into something heavy, something that hung over the table like a storm cloud. Sebastian, ever the diplomat, tried to keep the conversation light, but Clara could see the sharp edges of his tension as he exchanged clipped words with Julian. It was as though the two brothers were engaged in a silent battle, each one trying to stake their claim without saying a word. Julian, for his part, said nothing to Clara, his gaze often sweeping over her with a coldness that made her skin prickle. But when his eyes lingered on her for too long, she couldn't help but feel the heat of his stare, a silent message that made her heart race. She was becoming increasingly aware of the fact that his presence, his very silence, spoke volumes. And when the dinner ended and Clara made her way back to her room, she couldn't help but wonder what was happening between them. What was Julian feeling? Was this just jealousy, a protective instinct over his brother? Or was there something more beneath the surface? The questions plagued her as she undressed for bed, her mind spinning with confusion and desire. In the days that followed, the tension between the brothers grew more pronounced. Julian became increasingly possessive in his own way. His coldness to Clara in public was matched only by the heat in his eyes whenever Sebastian was near her. He seemed to lurk in the background, always watching, always waiting for a moment when he could intervene. Sebastian, on the other hand, remained oblivious, continuing his courtship in the same easy, charming manner as before. But with every touch, every word, Clara grew more uncomfortable. She could no longer ignore the truth. She was caught between two men, one of whom was engaged, the other who barely spoke to her. And yet, despite her best efforts to distance herself, she couldn't help but feel herself drawn to both of them in ways she couldn't explain. The more she tried to understand her feelings, the more everything seemed to spiral out of control. Julian's jealousy was growing more apparent, and it was becoming increasingly clear that his cold indifference was just a mask for something deeper, something darker. Clara was caught in the middle of it all, unable to escape the pull between the two brothers. As she lay in bed that night, her thoughts once again turning to the moment when she had felt Julian's eyes on her, how he had looked at her with such intensity, such yearning, that it had made her heart race. What did it mean? Was it just jealousy? Or was there something more, something that neither of them had been willing to acknowledge? She didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a game anymore. Something was shifting, something dangerous, something impossible to ignore. The arrival of Lady Amelia Hartwick at Montfort House marked the beginning of a new chapter of tension, one that Clara hadn't anticipated, but quickly realized would shape everything that followed. The day was crisp and clear, the sky a perfect shade of blue as the Hartwick family's grand carriage rolled through the estate gates. Clara had been outside in the garden, trying to collect her thoughts after a long, sleepless night filled with too many questions and not enough answers. She hadn't seen Julian that morning, but she felt his presence looming over everything, even when he wasn't near. When the carriage doors opened and Amelia stepped out, Clara couldn't help but notice the sharp contrast between her and the other women of the house. Amelia was everything Clara was not, elegant, poised, and impossibly beautiful in that cold, ethereal way that made her seem more like a statue than a woman. With her ice-blonde hair, perfect features, and steely eyes, she commanded attention the moment she stepped onto the grounds, and Clara instinctively straightened her back, the sudden awareness of her own appearance overwhelming. As Lady Amelia glided into the entrance hall, Clara felt something tighten in her chest. There was no warmth in Amelia's smile, no kindness in the way she greeted anyone. She simply moved with a calculated grace, her every action deliberate, and yet it was her eyes, those sharp, cold eyes, that unsettled Clara the most. Amelia was beautiful, yes, but there was something else there too, something that made Clara uneasy. It wasn't just that Amelia was a fiancée of Sebastian, a fact Clara had already come to terms with. It was the way Amelia moved with a sense of ownership, as though Montfort House, and everything within it, belonged to her by right, and that included Sebastian. But as the days went by and Amelia settled into the house, Clara began to notice something else, something more personal. Amelia was not only possessive of Sebastian, but she was also openly dismissive of Clara, her condescending tone and icy demeanor making it clear that Clara, as a paid companion, was nothing more than an afterthought in her world. One evening, when Clara was in the hallway returning from the kitchen, Amelia crossed her path, her lips curling into a smile that held no warmth. "Ah, the new companion," Amelia said, her voice dripping with fall sweetness. "How quaint. I didn't realize they allowed the help to wander about the house so freely." Clara's stomach churned at the comment, but she kept her head high, refusing to let the venom in Amelia's words show on her face. "I assure you I'm not wandering. I'm merely on my way to my room." Amelia's eyes narrowed, and her smile turned brittle. "I hope you're not too comfortable, dear," she said with a sweetness that didn't quite reach her eyes. "After all, I'm sure your position here isn't permanent. You're simply filling in until someone more suitable can take your place." Clara's heart stung, but she refused to show how deeply the words had cut. Amelia's cruelty was not just a display of superiority. It was an attempt to remind Clara of her place, to make her feel small, insignificant. The next few days were a blur of polite conversations and forced smiles, with Clara carefully avoiding any further direct confrontation with Amelia. But there was no escaping her presence. Amelia seemed to be everywhere, always by Sebastian's side, always in the center of the house, always watching Clara with that sharp, calculating gaze. It was becoming impossible to ignore the tension between them, and it wasn't just in the way Amelia looked at her. It was in the way Sebastian began to shift his attention. Clara noticed it almost immediately. His once easy, casual pursuit of her had begun to fade, replaced by a more polite, distant courtesy. He was still kind, but now there was an edge to his actions, as though he were walking on eggshells around both Amelia and Clara. At dinner one night, Sebastian made an offhand comment, asking Clara to save him a dance at the upcoming ball. Clara had agreed, though the thought of dancing with him in front of Amelia made her stomach twist. Amelia's icy demeanor had only sharpened since her arrival, and Clara knew that her involvement with Sebastian would not be tolerated. Amelia's thinly veiled hostility was beginning to show more clearly, and Clara couldn't ignore the way she watched them, her lips tight with restraint, her eyes never leaving them. How quaint. Amelia had said earlier in the evening when Clara was near Sebastian, her voice a little too loud for comfort. Even the staff gets to attend the ball, I see. It was a remark designed to hurt, and Clara could feel the sting of it deep in her chest. Sebastian, ever the diplomat, had tried to ease the tension, but it was clear Amelia's words had left a mark. As the evening wore on, Clara excused herself early, retreating to the library in an attempt to find some peace away from the growing drama. She had just settled into an armchair, a book in her lap, when the door swung open and Julian stepped inside. His appearance was as sudden and unexpected as the cold blast of air that followed him in. He didn't acknowledge her at first, walking past her to the window, but Clara could feel his presence in the room like a storm gathering. She watched him, her breath catching in her throat as she felt the familiar tension between them spark to life. Julian was colder than ever, his manner more distant, his eyes shadowed with something Clara couldn't read. He glanced at her, his gaze fleeting but intense, before turning back to the window. The silence between them stretched, thick and uncomfortable, before he finally spoke. "I see you're spending more time alone these days," he remarked, his voice low and almost indifferent. It was an observation, but it felt like something more, as though he was measuring her in a way that made her feel exposed. Clara swallowed, her throat dry. "It's peaceful here," she said quietly, not wanting to reveal the turmoil she was feeling inside. "I find it calming." Julian didn't respond immediately, and for a long moment they stood in silence, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on them. Clara could feel his eyes on her once again, the intensity of his gaze making her skin flush, but she refused to look at him, focusing instead on the pages of her book. Then, as though suddenly realizing he had been standing too long, Julian turned and walked out, leaving Clara with her thoughts swirling. That night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that the arrival of Amelia had set something in motion, something that neither she nor the Montfort brothers could control. Amelia's cold presence had shifted the balance in the house, but it was Julian's growing possessiveness, his dark, quiet jealousy, that made Clara's heart race. She could feel the weight of it, the unspoken tension that simmered between them, and she knew that the coming ball would be the tipping point. The question now was not just whether she could survive the social minefield that Amelia's arrival had created, but whether she was willing to let the very thing she feared, Julian's indifference, turn into something far more consuming. The storm was coming, and Clara could already feel the thunder rumbling. The grand ballroom at Montfort House had been transformed into a glittering sea of elegance, candles lighting every corner, chandeliers shimmering with 1,000 lights that cast a soft glow over the sea of silks and jewels. The music floated through the air, a perfect symphony of violins and piano, and the laughter of the aristocracy filled the room as the guests mingled and danced. The air was thick with excitement and anticipation, each person dressed in their finest attire, making it a night to remember. For Clara, however, the evening felt like a heavy cloak draped over her shoulders, the weight of the impending scandal and tension between the brothers pressing down on her with each passing moment. She had never attended a ball like this, certainly not as a paid companion, and the idea of being the subject of whispered gossip made her stomach turn. Yet, as she descended the grand staircase, all eyes turned toward her. The sudden hush that fell over the room made her heart race, and for a brief moment, she felt as if she were walking into a dream. The midnight blue silk gown Beatrice had gifted her clung to her frame, the fabric soft and cool against her skin, the low neckline modest yet flattering, and her hair was arranged in soft curls adorned with pearls. She barely recognized herself in the mirror, the transformation so complete it almost felt unreal. The gown, the jewelry, the delicate sapphire necklace borrowed from Beatrice, all of it made her feel like a stranger in her own skin. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, the room seemed to hold its breath, a collective gasp passing through the guests as they stared at her, some in admiration, others in shock. It was a sharp contrast to the life she had once known, where she had been the one doing the admiring, not the object of it. Sebastian was the first to spot her, his eyes lighting up with genuine delight as he made his way toward her. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice low, filled with admiration. He didn't finish his sentence, his words trailing off as he took her hand, a smile on his lips. His gaze never left her, and Clara felt a sudden warmth flood her chest, despite the tension building in the pit of her stomach. She had to remind herself, once again, that Sebastian was promised to Amelia, that he was not free to act on whatever feelings he might have had. As the two of them exchanged pleasantries, Clara became aware of the other presence in the room, Julian. He stood across the ballroom, his tall figure hard to miss, his dark eyes locked on her from the moment she entered the room. He was still unmoving, his gaze intense, as though he were studying her. She couldn't look away, even if she wanted to. There was something magnetic about the way he watched her, his gaze both cold and burning at the same time. It made her feel exposed, as if he saw straight through her, into her very soul. And yet, despite the chill in his expression, there was something else, something she couldn't quite name, that made her pulse quicken. He stood apart from the crowd, his posture rigid, as if he were intentionally isolating himself from the festivities, but his eyes never left her. For a brief moment, she found herself caught between two worlds, the warmth of Sebastian's attention, his constant kindness, and the icy, unrelenting pull of Julian's gaze, which felt as if it were drawing her into a dark, dangerous vortex. As she turned to look back at Sebastian, the moment was broken. Amelia entered the ballroom shortly after, and with her came an immediate shift in the atmosphere. Her ice-blonde beauty and imperious presence were impossible to miss, and the way she moved through the room, gliding rather than walking, immediately commanded attention. She didn't glance at Clara as she passed, her eyes fixed solely on Sebastian. The possessiveness in her gaze was unmistakable. Amelia was aware of the stir Clara had caused with her entrance, but her focus was on her fiancé, and she made no attempt to hide her displeasure at the attention Clara was receiving. As Sebastian and Clara stood in conversation, Amelia's eyes locked onto them with a sharpness that made Clara's stomach tighten. There was no mistaking it. Amelia was aware of the shift in Sebastian's demeanor, the way his attention seemed more focused on Clara than on her, and she did not like it. The evening progressed in a series of dances and polite exchanges, the tension between the brothers simmering beneath the surface. Sebastian had asked Clara to say to him a dance, and despite the gnawing unease in her chest, she had agreed. When the waltz began, Sebastian took her hand and led her onto the dance floor with his usual charm, his easy smile making her heart ache with the sweetness of it all. But as they danced, Clara couldn't ignore the feeling of eyes on her. Julian was still across the room, watching her intently, his posture rigid, as though he were a man on the edge of losing control. His eyes followed every movement, every step she took with Sebastian, and the intensity of his gaze made her skin flush. The music swirled around them, but Clara was painfully aware of the magnetic pull between herself and Julian, even from a distance. The dance felt different this time, too intimate, too personal, even though it was merely a polite waltz. Sebastian's hand rested on her waist, and though it was innocent enough, Clara couldn't help but feel a flicker of discomfort, the awareness of Julian's gaze settling over her like a heavy cloak. The dance ended, and Sebastian led her back to the edge of the room, his hand lingering a moment too long on hers. "You were perfect," he said, his voice low, a smile playing at the corners of his lips. Clara's heart skipped a beat, but she managed to offer a smile in return. "Thank you," she replied, her voice strained. Before they could say anything else, the music shifted, and another gentleman approached, eager to claim her for the next dance. As Clara moved away with her new partner, she could feel Julian's gaze on her once again. The air between them felt charged, as though everything was about to unravel. The evening had only just begun, but already Clara felt the tension building to a breaking point. As she danced with her new partner, her thoughts drifted back to Julian. What was he thinking? What was he feeling? She had no idea, but one thing was certain: his eyes never left her. Across the ballroom, Julian stood like a statue, a dangerous calm in his posture, and Clara knew that whatever came next would change everything. The storm was brewing, and the ball was the perfect setting for the inevitable explosion. As she danced through the crowd, the weight of the night settled on her shoulders. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, but it was Julian's gaze that held her captive, and she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever happened next, whether it was in the dance, in the quiet of a conversation, or in the very look that passed between them, would be the turning point. This night would not be forgotten. It was only a matter of when everything would come to light, when the unspoken tension between herself and the Montfort brothers would finally reach its breaking point. The ball had reached its peak by midnight, the guests slightly tipsy from the flowing champagne. Their inhibitions lowered as the music grew faster, the laughter louder. The evening had been filled with polite exchanges, the sort of light conversation that came with polite society. But for Clara, each passing minute felt like a slow burn, the tension between herself and the Montfort brothers threatening to boil over. She had danced with Sebastian several times, each moment filled with that same warmth and charm that had drawn her to him in the first place, but it was becoming harder to ignore the way Julian's gaze never left her. Every time she turned her head, there he was, across the room, watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken and her breath hitch. She couldn't avoid him, not when the pull between them was so strong, so undeniable. As the evening wore on, it became harder to ignore the growing chasm between the two brothers. Sebastian, ever the considerate one, was engaged in a conversation with Lady Amelia at the far side of the room. Though his smile was strained, his eyes constantly flicking toward Clara. He seemed to be aware of the growing tension, though he did nothing to address it. Meanwhile, Julian, still standing alone against the wall, had been watching her dance, his posture stiff, his eyes burning with a mixture of anger and something else, something far more dangerous. Clara could feel his gaze, like a weight pressing down on her, making every moment with Sebastian feel like an impossible choice. The longer she danced, the more aware she became of the fact that Julian was not just observing her. He was waiting for something. And then it happened. Sebastian, laughing lightly at something Amelia had said, reached for Clara's hand and tugged her gently toward him. "Come, Clara," he said, his voice warm. "One more dance, yes? The waltz is starting." He smiled at her, but there was something different in his eyes. It was as if he, too, could feel the weight of the situation, and though he smiled, it didn't quite reach his eyes. Clara hesitated for just a moment, her heart pounding in her chest as she glanced across the room to where Julian stood, still watching her with that icy intensity. Before she could answer, the moment stretched unbearably long, and just as Sebastian pulled her closer, Julian's voice cut through the space between them, sharp and commanding. "Clara." The sound of his voice, cold, deep, full of authority, stilled the air around her, and the room seemed to quiet, as if the music itself had faltered. Sebastian stopped mid-step, his hand still holding Clara's, and Clara's heart leaped into her throat as Julian's dark eyes locked onto hers. She could see the storm building within him, the unspoken tension finally about to explode. Without waiting for any sort of permission or acknowledgement, Julian strode across the ballroom, his long strides purposeful, cutting through the crowd like a force of nature. Guests parted in his wake, their eyes wide with curiosity and some measured concern. The low murmur of the crowd grew louder, whispers spiraling through the room as Julian reached them. Clara barely had time to react before Julian grasped her wrist, his fingers burning through her gloves as he pulled her away from Sebastian, ignoring the surprised look on his brother's face. "Excuse us, Sebastian," Julian muttered, the words biting with a coldness that sent a shiver down Clara's spine. Sebastian opened his mouth to protest, but Julian was already dragging Clara away, pulling her through the ballroom with an urgency that left no room for argument. Clara's heart hammered in her chest, her pulse racing as she tried to keep up with Julian's furious pace. She barely registered the shocked gazes of the other guests, nor the way Amelia's glare followed them, her face a mask of pure disdain. All Clara could focus on was the way Julian's grip tightened on her wrists, how his presence felt like a storm cloud, dark and foreboding, enveloping her with every step. Before she could gather her wits or say anything, they reached the darkened corridor off the ballroom, the silence around them thick and suffocating. Julian didn't let go of her wrist, his hand still holding her firmly, and he turned to face her, his chest rising and falling with the force of his breathing. "You're flirting with the wrong brother, Miss Ashford," he said, his voice low, but it was laced with something that made Clara's stomach flip. The words were sharp, bitter, but there was something else there, something beneath the anger that Clara couldn't name. She felt a flicker of defiance rise within her, the need to fight back against his accusation. "Am I?" she asked, her voice trembling despite herself. "Because he's been kind to me, Julian. He's been the one who sees me. He's the one who's treated me with respect." The words came out before she could stop them, and as soon as she said them, she felt the sting of them, as if she had betrayed a part of herself by admitting it. But Julian's expression darkened, and he took a step closer to her, his body nearly pressing against hers, trapping her between him and the cold stone wall. "Kind," he repeated, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "You want kind, Miss Ashford?" His hand slid to her throat, his thumb gently tracing her pulse, and Clara's breath caught in her throat at the sensation of his touch. "Is that really what you want? Tepid kindness from a man who will forget you the moment something more desirable comes along." The word stung, and Clara felt her anger flare. "What else could I possibly want from you, Julian?" she spat, her chest heaving with the force of her frustration. "You've barely spoken to me, let alone treated me like a person. You've ignored me, acted as though I don't even exist. What do you expect me to do?" Julian's eyes darkened as he leaned in closer, his face only inches from hers, and for a moment Clara thought he might kiss her. But then his expression shifted, his jaw tightening, and he stepped back, his breath ragged as he tried to regain control. "Nothing?" he asked quietly, his voice breaking, and for the first time, Clara saw the flicker of something vulnerable in his eyes, something raw and real. "You think you're nothing to me?" His forehead dropped to hers, and Clara felt the weight of his words, the rawness in his voice, like a punch to the gut. She was so close to him now that she could feel the heat radiating off his body, the tension crackling between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and Clara could feel the world around them slipping away, leaving only the two of them in the dark, quiet corridor. She didn't know what to say, what to feel, but she knew one thing. Everything had just changed. And then, as though the moment had shattered like glass, a voice called out from a ballroom. "Julian." It was Sebastian, his voice filled with alarm and confusion. And just like that, the spell between Clara and Julian was broken. They both froze, and Julian's expression shuddered instantly, the coldness returning to his features like a mask he had worn for years. "I'll deal with this later," Julian muttered, his hand releasing her wrist as he turned on his heel and strode back toward the ballroom, leaving Clara standing there, breathless and shaken. She watched him go, her pulse still racing, her mind whirling with what had just happened. What had he meant? What was that moment between them? She could feel the lingering heat of his touch on her skin, the echo of his words in her mind, and she knew, that everything had just changed. The storm was no longer coming. It had already arrived. Clara sat on the edge of her bed, her hands trembling as she packed her few belongings into a small, worn bag. The room was dim, the only light coming from the flickering fire in the hearth. She had spent the last few hours trying to convince herself that leaving Montfort House was the only sensible option, the only way to avoid the chaos, the heartbreak, and the scandal that had been building ever since her arrival. But the truth was, she didn't know if she was running from the Montfort brothers or if she was running from herself. She hadn't planned for this. She hadn't planned for the slow, steady burn of attraction she had felt toward both Julian and Sebastian, each one in his own way pulling her in, each one making her question everything she thought she knew about love, about desire, about duty. But the truth was now impossible to ignore. Julian wanted her. She had felt it, seen it in his eyes, in the way he had almost kissed her in that dark corridor, in the way he had held her wrist, dragging her away from Sebastian without any care for propriety or consequence. His words from that moment echoed in her mind, the rawness of them, the truth of them. "You think you're nothing to me?" No, she had never been nothing to him. The realization was both terrifying and thrilling, and Clara knew she could no longer pretend that her feelings for Julian weren't real. But then there was Sebastian, whose kindness had been like a balm to her wounded heart. He had made her laugh, made her feel seen when no one else had. His gentle affection had been the only thing that kept her grounded in a world that had been turned upside down by her father's downfall and her new role as a companion to the elderly Duchess. Sebastian was easy, safe, the kind of man any woman would dream of. Yet even as she thought of him, Clara felt a pang of guilt. He was promised a Lady Amelia, and she had to respect that. She had to, but the problem was that she no longer knew where her heart lay. She had tried to be indifferent, tried to focus on the connection she had with Sebastian, but Julian's presence was always there, lurking in the shadows, watching her every move with those intense, dark eyes that had never once let her forget that he saw her, that he was aware of her in a way no one else had ever been. She had spent the past few days trying to avoid both brothers, trying to retreat into the small, quiet world she had built for herself in Montfort House. But it was impossible. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the pull between herself and Julian. Every time she saw him, she felt the magnetic force between them, the desire that neither of them could deny. And Sebastian, he hadn't given up, had he? He still sought her out, still treated her with a gentleness that made her heart ache with longing. But it wasn't enough anymore. She couldn't ignore the truth any longer. She was falling in love with Julian Montfort. Clara's breath hitched as she placed the last of her belongings into her bag. She had decided to leave, to escape the house, the brothers, and the complications that came with them. The scandal was inevitable now. After the events of the ball, she had felt Julian's touch, had been close enough to feel his breath on her skin, and there was no pretending that the feelings they had for each other could be ignored. But she had nothing to offer him. He was a duke, a man of high status and power, and she was nothing more than a paid companion. Her reputation was in tatters, her future uncertain, and no matter what feelings they shared, Clara knew she could never be the woman Julian needed, the woman who could stand by his side without the constant reminder of her past, of her station. She was a fool to even think she had a place in his world. As she fastened the straps of her bag, there was a soft knock on the door, and Clara's heart stopped. She knew who it was without having to hear the voice. It was Beatrice. The Duchess had been more than just an employer to Clara. She had been a source of guidance, of wisdom, and Clara had often found herself confiding in Beatrice when the weight of her situation became too much to bear. She stood frozen for a moment, torn between wanting to flee and wanting to stay and face the inevitable. Beatrice had known something was going on between the brothers, and Clara knew the time had come to confront her own feelings. She opened the door, finding Beatrice standing there, her expression unreadable. "You're leaving?" Beatrice's voice was soft, but there was a quiet authority in it that made Clara's heart ache. The Duchess didn't wait for her to speak, didn't need to. "I've known for some time now, Clara," Beatrice continued, stepping into the room and sitting down by the fire. "You've been torn between them, haven't you? Sebastian's warmth, Julian's intensity. But you have to choose. You can't live in two worlds." Clara bit her lip, her throat tight. She hadn't realized how much Beatrice had seen, how much the Duchess understood. The weight of her words pressed down on her, and Clara's hands shook as she sat down beside her, her mind racing with everything that had happened in the past few days. "I can't stay here, Beatrice," Clara said, her voice trembling. "There's no place for me. The scandal, the tension between them, it's all too much." Beatrice studied her for a moment, her eyes soft but knowing. "And where will you go, Clara? You've no family left, no future except the one you make for yourself." Clara closed her eyes, the words cutting deep. She hadn't thought beyond leaving, hadn't considered what her future would look like outside of Montfort House. She had thought she could slip away into the night, disappear without a trace. But now, in the quiet of this room, the truth hit her like a wave. She had nowhere else to go, and worse, she knew she didn't want to leave Julian behind. Not after everything. Beatrice sighed, her voice low and almost kind. "You can't escape what's between you and Julian, no matter how hard you try. He's a proud man, but he's not blind. He's been watching you. Clara, the way he looks at you, it's not just desire. He feels something, too." Clara's heart thudded painfully in her chest. The thought of Julian, of the way he had held her wrist in that corridor, the intensity of his words, the way he had looked at her, made her head spin. Could it be true? Could Julian really want her in the way she wanted him? Beatrice's eyes softened, her voice gentle. You can't run from it. Not anymore. The only choice you have now is to face it. Clara swallowed hard, her mind a whirl of emotions. She couldn't leave. She couldn't run. And as much as the thought terrified her, she realized she didn't want to. I don't know how to face him, Beatrice, she whispered, her voice breaking. What if I'm wrong? Beatrice smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. Then you'll have your answer. But I don't think you are. Clara looked up, her chest tight, and for the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone in this. Beatrice's quiet support, her faith in Clara, was the reassurance she needed. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger, but it was the only one she could walk. You're right, Clara said softly, a small but determined smile forming on her lips. I have to choose. And I'm not running anymore. The moment she said the words, she knew it was true. She couldn't run from Julian, from her own heart, not anymore. The choice had been made, and whatever the consequences, she would face them. The morning after the confrontation in the corridor, Clara sat in her small room, staring out at the garden. The world outside was still, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, but inside her heart, everything felt as though it were spinning out of control. The night had been restless, filled with thoughts of Julian and his words, those words that had burned through her like wildfire. You think you're nothing to me? The question echoed in her mind, the intensity in his voice still vibrating in her chest. She could still feel the heat of his body against hers, the almost kiss that had almost shattered every boundary she placed around herself. She had spent so many days telling herself that Julian was nothing more than an inaccessible figure, cold, distant, beyond her reach. But now, after everything, she couldn't deny what was right in front of her. He wanted her. The thought sent a shiver through her, a mix of fear and something else, something far more dangerous. Hope. But hope was a dangerous thing, and Clara had learned that lesson too many times to count. She had no right to hope. Her life, her position, her very existence was built on a fragile foundation of compromise and sacrifice. Julian Montfort was a duke. She was a paid companion, with nothing to offer him but a heart that had been shattered by life's cruel turns. He deserved more, someone who could stand by his side, without the weight of her past dragging them both down. As she sat there, her thoughts a storm of confusion, the door to her room opened, and Beatrice entered, her expression as calm as ever, though her eyes held a knowing gleam. I thought I might find you here, Beatrice said softly, sitting down beside Clara, her presence as comforting as it was commanding. You've made your decision, haven't you? Clara nodded, though she wasn't sure if she meant the decision to stay or the decision to face the storm that was coming. I don't know what to do, she whispered. I can't be what Julian needs. I don't even know if I can survive the scandal that would come from everything that's happened. Beatrice's gaze softened, and she placed a gentle hand on Clara's. You don't need to be perfect, she said with a quiet confidence. No one is. And Julian knows that better than anyone. He's not asking you to be someone you're not. He's asking for you, just as you are. Clara looked at the older woman, her heart heavy with the weight of her words. But I'm not enough. I don't belong in his world. The words felt like an admission of defeat, but they were the truth, weren't they? Julian's world was one of power, of duty, of cold, unyielding rules that Clara could never fit into. She had nothing to offer him but herself. Fragile, uncertain, a woman with no future beyond the walls of Montfort House. What you don't understand, my dear, Beatrice continued, her voice gentle but firm, is that Julian is not asking you to change. He's asking you to accept him as he is. He's been locked away in that fortress of his for so long, and he doesn't know how to reach out. But he's trying. You have to see that. He's trying for you. Clara's heart clenched at the words, the truth of them sinking in deeper than she could have anticipated. Julian had been a man of duty and cold propriety, of distance and control. But now he was something else. Something raw. Something vulnerable. And it scared her more than anything she had ever known. But it also pulled her in like a moth to a flame. She wanted him, more than she had ever wanted anyone. But she was scared. Scared of the unknown. Scared of the consequences. "I don't know if I can do it, Beatrice," Clara whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't know if I can face everything that would come with being with him. The scandal, the gossip, everything will be destroyed." Beatrice smiled, a small, knowing smile that held a depth of understanding. "You're right. It will be difficult. It will change everything. But sometimes, my dear, the things that are worth having are the very things that cost us the most. And Julian, he's worth the cost." Clara sat in stunned silence, the weight of Beatrice's words settling heavily on her heart. She knew the Duchess was right. She couldn't keep running from this thing between herself and Julian. No matter how hard she tried, no matter how many walls she built, the truth was unavoidable. She had to face it, and she had to face him. She stood up abruptly, her decision made, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and excitement. "I can't keep pretending," she said softly, more to herself than to Beatrice. "I have to know if he feels what I feel. I have to know if I'm just a passing fancy to him, or if there's something real between us." Beatrice's smile widened, and she rose from her chair, offering Clara a steadying hand. "Then go to him, Clara, and don't look back. What you're about to do will change everything. But it might just be the beginning of something wonderful." Clara nodded, though her mind was spinning with what was to come. She had no idea what Julian would say, how he would react, but she couldn't stay silent any longer. She couldn't keep pretending that she wasn't falling in love with him, that she didn't want to be with him no matter the cost. As she left her room and made her way toward the library, the place where Julian often retreated in the evenings, her heart pounded in her chest. She had never felt more alive and more terrified in her life. The library was quiet, the only sound the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Julian stood by the window, his back to her, his posture stiff and rigid, as though he were holding himself together by sheer force of will. Clara took a deep breath, her heart in her throat, as she stepped into the room. "Julian," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as they landed on her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between like an endless chasm. And then, with a single, decisive step, Julian crossed the room, his eyes locked onto hers, his presence overwhelming. "Clara," he said, his voice low, rough with emotion. "You came." Clara nodded, her breath shallow, her heart beating so fast she could barely think. "I couldn't leave," she said softly, "not without knowing what this is, what you feel." Julian's eyes flickered with something unreadable, something raw, as he stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "What I feel is more than I can put into words," he said, his voice a rasp. "But if you can accept me, accept everything I am and everything I'm not, then I want you. I want you, Clara, more than I've ever wanted anything in my life." The words hit her like a thunderclap, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. But then, in the silence that followed, she realized something. She wasn't afraid anymore. Not of him, not of the future, not of the cost. With a trembling hand, she reached for him, and when he took her in his arms, she knew, without a doubt, that she had made the right choice. This was the beginning of everything, and she was ready. The morning after Clara had made her decision, she woke with a mix of exhilaration and dread. The truth was now clear. She had chosen Julian. The weight of the moment, the heaviness of that realization, made her heart pound with both fear and excitement. She confessed to him, admitted everything she had buried deep inside, and he had reciprocated in ways that sent tremors through her soul. But now, as they prepared to face the world, his world, everything felt different. There was no turning back. The scandal that had seemed distant and abstract now loomed before her, its consequences shaping every thought she had. The news of Julian's actions the previous night, of their confrontation in the hallway, would surely have spread like wildfire. The whispers had already begun to stir, but now they would crescendo to an unbearable volume. The Montfort House ballroom, which had only days before been filled with excitement and elegance, now felt like a gilded cage, a place where reputations were made or broken with a single glance. Clara couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. How would society react to the union between the Duke and companion? Would the scandal tear them apart before they could even begin? But there was no time for doubt, no room for hesitation. The ball was still in full swing, and Julian was not the kind of man who could hide from his own decisions. They would have to face it all. As Clara descended the grand staircase, her heart leaped into her throat. She was dressed in the same midnight blue gown, the same jewels adorning her neck. But now it felt different. She felt different. The eyes of the room seemed to snap to her the moment she entered, the weight of every gaze pulling at her as she made her way down the staircase. Julian's arm at her back. Her hand, once trembling, was now steady in his. They walked together as if they were the only two people in the room. But Clara could feel the buzz of the crowd, the nervous energy, the sharp gazes. They were already whispering, already speculating. The silence in the room stretched to a point of unbearable tension before Julian's voice broke through. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I may have your attention," he called out, his voice steady and authoritative, carrying across the room like a command. Clara looked up at him in surprise, but there was no hesitation in his eyes, only resolve. He stepped forward, taking her hand in his and raising it slightly, a gesture that was both simple and profound. "I apologize for the disruption to this evening's festivities, but I have an announcement that cannot wait," he continued, his eyes never leaving Clara's. "Miss Clara Ashford has agreed to become my wife." The room seemed to still, the words hanging in the air like an electric charge. Clara's breath caught in her throat as a mixture of gasps and murmurs swept through the guests. She could feel the weight of their stares, the sharpness of their judgment. But there was nothing she could do to stop it. Julian's declaration had shaken the very foundation of society's expectations. The Duke of Montfort had just announced that he was marrying the woman who had once been nothing more than a companion. The scandal would be impossible to ignore. Clara's heart pounded, but Julian's grip on her hand was firm, reassuring. She was with him. That was all that mattered. "You!" Amelia's voice cut through the shocked silence, her tone sharp with fury. "You can't be serious." The venom in her voice was unmistakable as she took a step forward, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Sebastian, you can't let this happen. This is ridiculous." Clara could feel the tension building as Amelia's glare turned to Sebastian, who stood a few paces behind Clara. He looked as though he had been struck speechless, his face pale as he tried to find the words to protest. But then, to Clara's surprise, he simply looked at her and smiled softly. "I suppose it's true," Sebastian said quietly, his voice carrying through the room. "I have been selfish. I should have stopped this long ago." He turned to Julian, offering him a nod of understanding. "But you've made your choice, and I'm happy for both of you." There was a collective gasp from the room, a murmur of disbelief at Sebastian's reaction, but it was clear that he meant it. For all his charm, for all his kindness, Sebastian knew his brother better than anyone. If Julian had made this decision, it was final. The room seemed to hold its breath as the reality of the moment set in. Sebastian turned to Clara, his smile genuine but tinged with sadness. "Be happy, Clara," he said softly. "I hope you find the joy you deserve." Amelia stood there, frozen, her eyes wide with shock, and for a moment, Clara thought she might collapse in on herself. "No," Amelia whispered, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "This is outrageous. You can't marry her, Julian. She's a nobody." The words stung, cutting through the air like a slap, but Clara held her ground. Amelia's venom only proved how little she understood of what was happening, how little she understood the real connection between Clara and Julian. Amelia, whose beauty had once seemed so perfect, was nothing more than a hollow shell now, her world crumbling around her as Julian's eyes never left Clara's. He was not looking at Amelia. He was looking at Clara, and Clara knew, in that moment, that this was not a game. This was real. "She is everything to me," Julian said, his voice cutting through the whispers like a blade. "And I will marry her, not because of some societal obligation, but because I love her." Clara's heart swelled at the words, but before she could say anything, Beatrice stepped forward, her presence commanding the room. "It seems to me that this is a matter between the bride and groom," she said, her voice warm but filled with authority. "And anyone who has a problem with it can leave." Her words, simple but powerful, were enough to silence the room. The aristocrats, the gossip mongers, the judgmental onlookers, all of them froze, the air thick with their uncertainty. They could do nothing but watch as Clara and Julian stood together, side by side, unyielding and unafraid. Clara's mind raced, but one thought persisted through the chaos. She had made the choice to stay, to face the storm that would follow, and now she had Julian by her side. That was all that mattered. Amelia stormed out, her steps heavy with rage, and a few other guests followed, their whispers trailing behind them. The room slowly began to settle, the tension not entirely gone but shifted. Then, as the orchestra began to play once more, Julian turned to Clara, his eyes softening as he took her hand in his. "Let's dance, my love," he said, his voice low and steady. And with that, they walked to the center of the room, the eyes of the room upon them. But it didn't matter anymore. The whispers, the judgment, they meant nothing. For the first time, Clara felt free. The music swirled around them as they danced, their movements synchronized, their hearts beating in time. Nothing else mattered. The world outside the ballroom could crumble. Julian had claimed her, and she had claimed him, and together they would face whatever came next, hand in hand. 2 years had passed since that fateful ball at Montfort House, and Clara sat beneath the shade of an oak tree in the garden, her hands resting on her round belly. The estate, once so cold and distant, had been transformed into a home, a place filled with laughter, warmth, and life. The grounds were in full bloom, the roses climbing up trellises, and the hedges manicured with care. The air smelled of jasmine, fresh grass, and the sweetness of the season. Clara, now 25, looked every bit the lady she had always dreamed of being, though never imagined she could be. Her gown was simple, comfortable, her hair done in soft waves, but it was a gentle curve of her pregnancy that made her heart swell with happiness. As she watched her 18-month-old daughter, Emma, toddle through the grass, chasing after butterflies with all the exuberance a child could muster, Clara felt a deep, unshakable sense of contentment. She hadn't expected this life, hadn't imagined that she would ever be so loved, so cherished. The hardship she had endured in her youth, the loss of her family's fortune, the heartache of being nothing more than a companion, those had all faded into distant memories, replaced by the vibrant joy of her new life. Julian Montfort, her husband, her partner, was everything she had once thought she could never have. He had not just claimed her in that dark corridor of the ball, but had given her a life, one filled with affection, respect, and a bond that had only grown stronger with time. Their love, once born out of chaos and scandal, had flourished into something beautiful, undeniable, and wholly theirs. Clara had never imagined that Julian's cold exterior would give way to the warm, tender man he had become for her, for their family. The walls he had built around his heart had crumbled slowly, brick by brick, as she had shown him love in ways no one else could. In return, he had given her a life of security and peace, something she had longed for but never believed she would find. Their home, once an imposing mansion of formality, was now a place of joy. The servants, who had once watched the tension between the brothers from afar, now spoke of the couple with admiration. Beatrice, Julian's mother, had been the quiet architect behind their union, pulling strings behind the scenes, but Clara had come to love her as much as she loved her own family. The elderly Duchess, now in her late 60s, still commanded the household with grace and humor, but it was clear to everyone that Montfort House had become a place of true warmth, a place that once lacked life, now full of laughter and love. Clara's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. She turned her head to see Julian riding up on horseback, his tall, broad frame silhouetted against the afternoon sun. As he dismounted, he scooped up their daughter, who squealed in delight, her tiny hands reaching for him as he laughed. "How are my 2 favorite girls?" he asked, his voice deep and affectionate, his eyes alight with warmth as he kissed Clara's cheek. "Your daughter refused her nap again," Clara said with a smile, her eyes twinkling with a familiar teasing. "Our daughter," Julian corrected gently, holding Emma up to his shoulder as she giggled, her dark hair tumbling around her face. "She's just like you, strong-willed." Clara laughed, a sound that had become as much a part of her as her breath. "She's stubborn. I'll give you that," she said, reaching out to smooth a lock of hair from Emma's face. Julian kissed her forehead tenderly, his hand resting lightly on her pregnant belly. "And how's our son?" he asked, his voice softening as he looked at her with deep affection. Clara placed a hand on her belly, smiling up at him. "I don't know yet, but I'm sure he'll be just as strong-willed as his sister." Julian chuckled, his eyes glinting with amusement. "I can hope for a peaceful child, just once." Clara raised an eyebrow playfully. "And when was the last time you had peace in your life?" she asked, her voice teasing. "Good point," Julian said, his lips curling into a smile as he sat down beside her on the blanket, Emma now running off to explore the garden once more. "But I wouldn't have it any other way." The warmth of his words settled over her, and Clara couldn't help but feel a wave of gratitude. The once distant, icy Duke of Montfort had become a man who could love fiercely, who would go to any lengths to protect his family, his home. She had never imagined she could have this life, not in her wildest dreams. The years had been kind to them, their bond growing ever stronger. It wasn't just love they shared. It was respect, understanding, a partnership built on a foundation of deep trust. There were no more walls between them, no more secrets. Julian was not just her husband. He was her equal, her confidant, her best friend. He had shown her a love she never believed she deserved, and in turn, she had given him the strength to be more than the cold, distant Duke he had once been. Their love had been forged in fire, yes, but it had become something unbreakable. As Clara watched their daughter, Emma, chasing after butterflies with the carefree joy of a child, she felt a rush of gratitude. This life, this family, this love, it was everything she had ever wanted, and it was hers. As Julian sat beside her, his arm around her waist, she leaned into him, her heart full as she looked up at him. "I never thought I would find this," she said softly, her fingers tracing the lines of his hand. "I never thought I'd have a family, a life like this. It feels like a dream." Julian smiled, his eyes softening as he kissed her forehead. "It's not a dream, Clara. It's our reality, and I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world." As they sat together, their daughter playing the grass, the world seemed perfect, whole, and full of promise. There were no more dark corridors, no more hiding in the shadows. There was only love and the future they would build together. The road ahead was uncertain, as all roads were. But with Julian by her side, Clara knew there was nothing they couldn't face. They had chosen each other, and that was all that mattered. And as the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the estate, Clara leaned her head against Julian's shoulder, knowing that they had everything they needed. They had each other, and that was enough.